Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Tallman. I'm the Poetry Ambassador for Miami-Dade County and an Associate Editor with South Florida Poetry Journal. And today I have the pleasure of talking to Paul Tran about their new book, All the Flowers Kneeling, which was published by Penguin Books in February of this year. And in this book, Paul investigates intergenerational trauma, sexual violence, and U.S. imperialism in order to radically alter our understanding of freedom, power, and control. And it's also a book about survival and love. So welcome, Paul. Where are you joining us from today?
Thank you for having me, Nicole. I am so grateful to talk to you, and I'm coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin.
Excellent. So you'll be joining us here in Miami fairly soon for the book fair.
Yes, yes.
With your debut poetry collection. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Will this be your first time attending the book fair?
No, I think it will be my second time. I was a Kundiman Fellow in Adrian Matika's workshop at the Miami Book. No, I lied. It is my first time. It is my first time. Yes.
Well, everyone will be so lucky to have you there. I think you're going to have a really good time. We've got a great lineup this year. So you'll be presenting, like I said, on the 20th of November at 1 p.m. with Franny Choi, Safia El-Hilla? I think it's
Hello.
And Saeed Jones on a panel called Everyday Apocalypses. So everyone make sure you mark your calendars to check that out because that's going to be a really cool event. You know, to get us started, I'm hoping most people have read your book, but if they haven't, I'd like to give them a little bit of a taste of it. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind reading, and I don't know if you're open to requests, but if you are.
100%.
Okay, well, I love elegies. And I would love to hear you read Lipstick Elegy, which is on page 39. I'm sure you know where your own, your poems are on your own book, but just for everyone following along, we're on page 39 if you want to follow along while Paul reads us this amazing poem. Oh, I can't wait.
Lipstick Elegy. I climbed down to the beach facing the Pacific. Torrents of rain sure the sand. On the other side, my grandmother sleeps soundlessly in her bed, her aoyai of the whitest silk. My mother knew her mother, died long before the telephone rang like bells announcing the last American helicopter leaving Saigon. Arrow shot back to its bow, long distance missile. She'd leap into the sky to fly home if she could. Instead, she works overtime, curls her hair with hat rollers, rouges her cheeks like Gong Li and Raise the Red Lantern, and I am her understudy, hiding in the doorways between her grief and mine. I apply her foundation to my face. I conceal the parts of me she conceals, puckering my lips as if to kiss a man that loves me the way I want to be loved. I speak their bewitching names aloud. Twisted rose, fuchsia in Paris, irreverence. I choose the lipstick she'd least approve of. My mouth, a pomegranate split open, a grenade with a loose pin in the kitchen. I wrap a white sheet around my waist and dance for hours, mesmerized by my reflection in a charred skillet. I laugh, her laugh, the way my grandmother laughed when she taught me to pray that you'd I be when I braided her hair in unbearable heat, my tiny fingers weaving the silver strands into a fishtail, a French twist, each knot a future she never named, buried in the soil of her, where she locked away the image of her sons and daughters locked away. I'm sorry, mother of my mother. Immortal bodhisattva with 1,000 hands, chewing a fist, a beetle root, your teeth black as dawn. No child in our family stays a child their mother can love.
That last line, oh, it gets me every time I'm tearing up. Oh my gosh, you are such an amazing performance poet. I mean, there are poems for the page and poems for the stage, and I feel like you've mastered both, which is it's just phenomenal to hear you read. I'm blown away.
Thank
Wow,
you.
gosh, what a beautiful, beautiful poem. You know, I noticed in the acknowledgement sections of your book, I love notes and I love acknowledgments. I read books very thoroughly, and I noticed that you called your book The Garden of Flowers,
Mm.
which is so lovely. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, the role that flowers and beauty play in this book, because I know the book is rife with trauma and pain and violence and grief, but I feel like there's so much beauty too. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
I I love that question. And in part because one of my goals in writing this book, which began about 9 years ago now, when I was raped in college, that made me go back and reckon with being molested as a child, with the legacy of sexual violence that my family has faced, particularly the women in my family, as survivors of the French Indochina War and the American War in Vietnam. But the word rape and the word trauma do not appear anywhere in this book. That was a decision that was made very early on because I wanted the book to be about our survival, our ingenuity, the fact that, I don't know, I watched my mom, refugees like her, invent ways to make it through this world every day, whether it was starting the first grocery stores, the first nail salons, the first tailoring shops. That courage to be the first to do anything and to find our way out of difficult situations, to find our way towards the lives we deserve. That was what I wanted the book to be about. And in no small way, I was very aware that, flowers is a lyric trope. Every poet has flowers, somewhere. But as often as they have appeared, I thought to honor that, to honor this thing that in winter is already thinking about spring, when it will arrive, that its beauty is momentary, but that momentariness is not in any way undermined by the fact that it will return again. And growing up in San Diego, California, where, in an apartment complex that was primarily concrete, my mom had this green thumb. She had all these pots full of flowers and trees, whatever she could grow. In the perimeter of our apartment, she did, as almost a way of reminding herself that she too can regenerate and resurrect and come back alive no matter what happens to her. And like so much, I took that for granted. But when I was putting this book together, I thought, oh, let me draw on that. Let me draw on the fact that it is nevertheless significant how we, put a seed into the earth, and despite all the conditions, that seed grows.
Absolutely. I'm curious about the title too, because I came across it on page 72. It's the
Yeah.
last line of the Santa Ana, but I wasn't entirely sure where it came from. All the flowers kneeling. How did you come? How did you arrive at that title?
Oh, well, this poem has several funny stories attached to it. One of the stories is when I first started as a very young poet, particularly because I was writing out of this experience of extremity, and one in which I felt that those in positions of authority around me did not want to believe. When I reported it to my school, I was given two pamphlets, one for psych services and one for time management, and was warned if I did not manage my time, if I did not complete my coursework, I would lose my scholarship. The entire focus was not on justice, was not on healing, but on my efficacy as a minority student in this institution, that I had to remain excellent despite what was going on. And so when I came up through spoken word and through poetry slam, I was largely a narrative poet. I told, my story because I needed someone to believe me. And I needed to recount the minute details as a way of assuring myself, yeah, that's what happened. Here's the evidence. that no one else bothered to collect. And so when I entered my graduate program, one of my graduate advisors was like, you're a good storyteller. What other muscles of poetry have you yet to flex? One was sound. And my friend Erin Coleman read me this poem at Pegasus by Terrence Hayes. And for whatever reason, whether it was because it was snowing out, we were on the balcony watching the Winter Olympics, but my ear heard Terrence's speaker say fire and gyre in that poem. And some light bulb turned on. And I thought, I want to try that. I want to try a poem that is driven by attitude and sound and a ruthless commitment to its interior feelings, and just see where it goes. And so the first draft of this poem, the Santa Ana, was barely a page long, but somehow it ended on give me liberty or give me Death Valley. I want all the flowers kneeling. I don't know what part of my brain activated and arrived at that moment, but I owe it to Terrence, I owe it to Erin, and I owe it to Mary Jo Bang, who gave me this prompt to try something new. And I think that I offer that to my students a lot is, we all have our gifts. Let's give ourselves more gifts and see what we make with it. And in terms of what it means or what it represents, there are many valences. Flowers kneeling could be kneeling in submission, could be kneeling in a very faithful, devoted way, in observance or reverence, could be kneeling in death. It also could be simply the flowers that I see at night who curl inward in the absence of the sun. They're no more or less alive in the absence of that light. And so it was one of my, achieving that line was one of my lessons in this idea that lyric ambiguity allows the reader to participate. Whatever the possible meanings of I want all the flowers kneeling can be, I allow myself and the reader to participate in interpreting, identifying that meaning. And perhaps as time goes on, that meaning changes, but the ambiguity keeps that space open for all of us, the poem, myself, and the reader, to change our understanding of it.
I love that. So you're not necessarily being overly prescriptive. You're allowing it to be open to interpretation. That's cool. I'm also curious about the order and the pauses in your book. I'm something that I'm just curious about in general when I'm reading poetry books, whether they're delineated by sections or white space or some other sort of demarcation. Your book seems to be divided in 4 sections, I think, and I see you've used some beautiful imagery throughout as well. But I noticed there were 7 poems in the first section, 10 in the second, 3 in the third, and 9 in the fourth. And I'm wondering, how did you arrive at that particular structure?
Ooh, the arrival. I laugh because the arrival at it is so says a lot about my personality, which is, I think, as a child, growing up in incredible poverty in conditions where like graduating from high school or even going to college were not possible, I was a planner.
Mm.
I made plans. I set my ambitions into shape, everything that I wanted for my life, for my own body, for my beloveds, I had to find a form for those dreams. And so going into this project, sometimes I don't necessarily recommend this, but the architecture of the book came to me before some of the poems did.
Mm,
And it's not that I made a Word document with all the titles and said, here are the poems I'll write with these titles. It's more so that in literature, I found, no, I'll take a step back. In the assessment, we often impose on survivors of any kind of trauma is that they have a linear narrative progression toward triumph and healing.
mm,
We want to see someone go from A to B. Sometimes because as the observers or witnesses or readers or audience, maybe we selfishly don't want to worry about them when the book is done, or we want to feel good, that happy ending that concludes a thing that gives us that gives us the closure. But I find that for so many survivors, part of the healing, part of the reckoning with extreme events is seeing the manifold ways and the very sly, elusive ways that our behaviors and choices repeat the pain.
mm,
And so I wanted a book that did not go from A to B.
mm,
And so in poetry, there's this Greek rhetorical figure of chiasmus,
mhm,
which is often described as being a cage inside a cage. We see this in rhyming structures such as the Petrarchan sonnet, where the scheme goes A, B, B, A. We go from A to B, we linger there, and we go back to A. It's almost as though we take 2 steps forward and a step back. And I wanted that to inspire the structure for this book. And so thinking about A, B, B, A, the cage in a cage, I thought we should have 4 sections. One, that it begins in the immediate aftermath of the incident. The second being a travel into history, into the past, where the speaker can reckon with a time when it's occurred before. Then moving forward, gaining knowledge, having the courage to change their life. And then in the final section, picking up where we left off, where the choice to endure and persist must be made.
mm,
And so that's why it's in 4 sections. That's why it opens and closes with the poem Orchard of Unknowing, and then the poem Orchard of Unknowing.
mm,
That's why the beginning of the 2nd section has a poem called The Cave, and the ending of the 3rd has another poem called The Cave. It's as though we go into and we exit that cave. All of this, all of these nitty-gritty things accumulate to say, when putting, I think not just about the structure of individual poems, but the book overall. Can the book overall be its own poem, be its own version of the hero's journey?
mhm,
And that a book shouldn't simply be a convening of poems of a similar topic or of a single experience, but that a reader looking at the structure of the book itself might find some insight there.
mm. I love that. You mentioned sonnets, which is another form that I absolutely adore. And I thought that there were some poems in here that they seem to be sonnets on the surface. I don't want to assume, or maybe they're sonnet inspired, like Orchard of Knowing and Unknowing and Scheherazade,
Yes.
Scheherazade as well. I'm wondering, how do sonnets in particular speak to you?
Ooh. Yeah, first, yes, they are. Those are sonnets. And they speak to me in several ways. One, um, how do I put this? I want to answer this question by saying that whether explicit or implicit, there are certain demands imposed on a debut book by a young poet, or a new poet for that matter. That the book has to introduce the poet to the world, who they are, what they think about, their interventions. And then the book has to make some argument about the art of poetry itself, what poetry can do, and what it can do in the very hands of that writer. And so the first poem in my book is a sonnet where there's an encounter between the Buddha and a brigand who has murdered almost 1,000 innocents in order to return home to his family. What I hope, beyond the fact that that was one of the first stories my mother ever told me, and so it naturally became one of the first stories I wanted to tell the world as a way of sharing with the world what my mom gave me and my inheritance as her child, as a child of Vietnamese refugees. But the argument I make there is, and particularly as a poet who writes in free verse, I have studied this. I have been a student of poetry. And as nascent as I am, there are things I believe I understand. And so taking the sonnet, which comes to us from 13th century Sicily, this very canonical Western form, this form that has typically been used to describe unrequited love, courtly, royal courtships, and imbuing it with a story of the Buddha, with a story told to me by my mother, a Vietnamese American refugee with little means, with a limited education. There's a radical political argument being made there. And then in the long sonnet crown, Scheherazade, Scheherazade, which is broken into two halves. The first half, 7 sonnets occur in the first section of the book. The second half, another set of 7 sonnets occur in the last. I thought not only that the form itself appropriately enacted this character from literature and history who used storytelling to save her life, but also a kind of underappreciated character. Like, I had no idea that I thought Aladdin came to me. I thought Aladdin came to me from Disney. My mistake. But it came from A Thousand One Nights. It came from Scheherazade. So many of our stories, whether Romeo and Juliet, Tristan and Isolde, come from her tradition. And the fact that she's a woman of color, the fact that she's using her mind to escape violence, for members of the audience who may not know, there's a king in her time who, because of infidelity, takes a new bride every night and executes that bride in the morning. Scheherazade's sister is brought before the king, and Scheherazade, like in the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen volunteers herself and is like, I'll go. And she goes to the bedchamber and she begins to tell him this story in lieu of the regular ooh-ah-ahs. And in the morning, she ends on a cliffhanger. And the king's like, okay, what happens next? And she's, brilliant. So she's like, well, you'll have to invite me back if you want to know what happens next. And so he does so for 1,001 nights until she becomes the queen of this kingdom and puts an end to this violence. But even in just that summary I gave, as writers, we get the technique of frame story, of cliffhanger from her. And so honoring that was really important to me. And therefore changing what the sonnet can do, what it can contain, is, for lack of better words, a political argument I make with this book.
Well, you take it even, I'd say, a step further because you are so inventive that you came up with your own form, the Hydra. And I saw that demonstrated in I See Not Stars, but they're light reaching across the distance between us, correct?
Yes.
Could you tell our viewers what a Hydra is? I know it's probably a little lengthy explanation, but if you have time,
Oh,
I'm fascinated by this form. It's gorgeous, and I love that poem. I'd like you to talk about what you invented.
yes. And so I was in a graduate prosody workshop with Carl Phillips, and our final assignment um, was to invent a form that made interventions in the field. And so I thought, again, a canonical received form that so many of us are taught is the sonnet, particularly because of its rhetorical structures, its ability to compress story, feeling, um, that I thought part of the formal rules of a sonnet is that it typically ends on a heroic couplet. The
Mhm.
final two lines, lines 13 and 14, bring us to the end of an argument, to a conclusion. And in my experience, trauma doesn't allow for that. Trauma is messy. One injury spills into so many other injuries. It can take folks lifetimes to identify how one event impacted, any aspect of their life in noble and unnoble ways. And so part of my invented form is eliminating that conclusive couplet by having only 13 instead of 14 lines. That's the first intervention I made. The second is that in the final line of this poem, of this 13-line poem, are 13 words. And so it's a poem of 13 lines, and the final line has 13 words. The reason for that is because each of those 13 words will become the respective first words of the next 13 lines. And so if the poem ends, I see not stars, but their light reaching across the distance between us. Line 1 of the next poem will start with I, line 2 will start with see, line 3 will start with not, line 4, stars, and so forth. This makes an intervention on another received Western form, the sestina, which is typically in 6-line stanzas with an envoy of 3 lines, a final stanza of 3 lines. But in each of these 6-line stanzas, there are 6 words that are repeated in circular order at the very end. And so, and that's very typical of poetry, right? Rhyming typically happens at the end. And so naturally in the sestina, the repetition of these words occur at the end. But if you can see it from my point of view, a poet working in those conditions, right towards a known end. They write towards the rhyme. They write towards the word they must repeat. They know what the end is. Again, not my experience with trauma. We know where we begin with this incident, with this thing that must be overcome. But how many of us really know what our lives will turn out to be like? Whether we will be rescued, whether we will be safe. We are always living each day towards this grand unknown, hoping that we find meaning and purpose and happiness and love along the way. And so the idea that my invented form, the Hydra, has 13 lines, that the final line has 13 words, and that each of those words start the next line of the next poem means that we're starting from a known beginning and working towards an unknown end. And why all of this, beyond the sort of like nerdy fascinations, why might all of this be important? I believe that there's a relationship between form and experience. And that my goal as a poet is not to simply employ poetic devices or techniques to make my writing beautiful or pretty. It's to bring my life into the art. And so I had to create this form so that it would allow me to more accurately write about my life. And in that is its own radical argument. It's kind of saying that the sonnet is not sufficient for everything, that the sestina is not sufficient for everything. Though there are experiences, they would appropriately represent this one, mine, as a queer and trans person of color, as a first-gen, American student, like all those things. I had to create something that was my own. And I hope in doing that, I also permit others to be daring and bold and create their own poetic forms and realize that we don't have to rely on past traditions, that actually every day of our life, we've been inventing our life. And so as writers, it's no different.
I love that you embraced the number 13
Oh,
because
yes, the superstition, yes.
because in my thought, in American culture, 13 is an unlucky number. You walk into buildings and there's no 13th floor because of superstition, right? So I like that you owned it and you made it into something beautiful. It's a little bit brave in a way because a lot of people are afraid to even associate themselves with that number. So I love that you took it and made that into a new form. It's really cool.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, so I noticed in the book that the speaker and the mother seem to have experienced a similar trauma, but it's not openly discussed between the two of them. It's almost like this protection of self and other, and there's kind of a tenderness and a love in that. I'm wondering, would you describe writing this book as a recovery of sorts? And what does this book say to other trauma survivors without being overly prescriptive, of course?
I mean, towards the first half of your question, some stories are mine to tell and some are not. And I have to respect the fact that my mom does not want to talk clearly about what's happened to her. And that for her, survival means being oblique or changing her story every time she tells it so that only she knows the truth. And even though, growing up, I resented that because it's like, how many versions of the story must I keep in my head? Where were you trafficked to? Who did it? But I'm like, no, that's her right. It's her story. And in a way, we're dichotomous because of it. She tells, every time she tells her story, something changes because she wants to keep the truth to herself. And here I am just telling, random people about what happens to me because I want people to know. And I want my version of the story to outlast the version that those in power would rather have, which is that it didn't occur, that, whatever. But through writing this book, I realized there are as many ways to survive as there are survivors. And so she has one, I have one. Our strategies meet in poems like Scheherazade. they meet in poems like Year of the Monkey, where, I give myself permission to say, like, we did the best, we're doing our best for each other, and that's what matters. We are making our way through the world as we know how. And as we grow, as we change and develop better strategies, the stories we tell and how we tell those stories will also change. Now, towards what I hope other survivors get from it, or anyone who's been through a situation they thought they could not get out of, maybe it's the same insight that for me, sometimes survival begins as an idea in the mind, as that it begins by changing the story we have about ourselves. I am not just this. I am not, what happened to me. I am also this. I can be this. I will be this. And changing that story, changing how we tell that story, is usually, it can help us get there. And so, if nothing else, that a reader of this book might find a speaker from page 1 to the very end, changing their mind about themselves, changing the story they tell about themselves, and that reader believes they can also do that, then the work is done.
Wow. As I was reading through this book, I saw such a richness of influences. Yeah. There are a lot of individual poets that you mentioned in the acknowledgement sections, but also it seems like there's we see the influence of science and experiments, right? We see the influence of music. We see the influence of just so many things. I'm curious, because you said that it took you 9 years to write this book.
I mean, it came together over the course of 9 years, or at least it was 9 years between when the incident happened and when this book came to be. Yeah.
Okay, so the various influence, is there one particular influence that you would, I guess, is there one particular thing that you would say has the most influence? Because there's also this aspect of spirituality, right? There's so many themes in this book. I think that was one thing that I really appreciated about it so much, is because it was so rich in thematic content. It's not just one thing. In fact, if I were challenged to summarize what the book is about, it's almost difficult to do that, because you span so many topics and space and influences. But I'm curious, is there one of those things in particular that you feel was the most influential as you were writing this book?
Well, none of those influences are more important than the other. When I by the skin of my teeth, graduated from college and moved to New York City, I had the opportunity to do a fellowship at Poets House. And part of that fellowship, I got to work with Rachel Eliza Griffiths and Rigoberto Gonzalez, who met me in Central Park one day. And I will never forget the advice he gave me, which was, be as intersectional as you can in your writing. And your writing will be singularly yours. In part because who else in the world grew up on the street you grew up in the house you grew up in, with the parents you had, and walked, the way you walked to school, wore the clothes you wore, ate the food you ate, made the choices you made? There's, for all of us, no one else. We are the only ones who've lived our lives. And I find that in many poetry collections, there are this, debut and otherwise, there's a valuing of the focused meditative lyric, where the concern of the book might be easily summarized, the themes or the influences of the book might be easily summarized, and even the aesthetic of the book. It's important to me to show all the aspects of who I am. And as wild as this book gets, it's like, not even half of it, right? It's like, I was just like, my sorry, my childhood was spent in this MD PhD training program, and so science had to be part of the book. My favorite class in high school was art history, because all the weirdo art kids like ate in the bungalows behind the locker room with Mr. Smith, and so art had to be part of the book. And I was a history major in college and thought I was going to be a history professor, and so history had to enter. But then there was the natural history that I inherited from my mom, from the Vietnam War, from American Empire. That had to enter the book. And then there's the minute things of like my favorite foods, my favorite music, rather than thinking it's too much, it was such a joy to figure out how much can I include? So that someone, because here's the thing, right? For so many of us, we are reduced to that one story. For growing up in the poetry slam, like, I'd be chain smoking my cigarette outside the New Eurekan Poets Cafe and would hear someone say, oh, don't worry about Paul. They're just going to do another one of their rape poems.
Mm.
And how decimating it was to hear that two people, and sometimes people I respected, I was a poet who wrote one poem. I mean, that's how trauma works, right? It locks us in to a state of being. And for those of us who use art as a way of healing, yeah, we're going to be focused on perhaps a single subject matter for a long time, but that's not the totality of who we are. And I did not want someone closing this book and saying, oh, Paul wrote this book about blank and blank. No, there's so much in here. All the things that have fascinated me passed through my mind. You could not say that a full life has not been lived, that this mind has not thought about literature and TV and for me, a full human being steps forward. And so, Nicole, exactly what you said, like, it's hard to summarize. I take that as a great, I appreciate you saying that so much, because a real human life should be hard to summarize.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would like to hear you read a little bit more, but before I go to that, I just wanted to ask you, was there anything that I didn't ask you about that you want our readers to know? Anything you want people to know?
Fabulous. Are you kidding? This. Thank you for asking the questions you asked and for giving me a chance to answer them and for giving me a chance to share with people who I am and how I think. And I say that because I believe that poems are so deeply tied to the person. And in literature, in American literature, in American history, we have seldom seen queer and trans people of color been the provenance of wisdom and insight about what it means or what it looks like to be alive in a given place and time. We have not really been the protagonists. And so thank you for giving me a chance to answer these questions and to show people who I am, what I can do, and what I hope to have translated into poems in this book.
It's
But
been
I'm here to
such.
take your requests. So anything you want to hear, I'm happy to read it.
This is my favorite part, and I would really like to hear Copernicus if you would do me the honor.
Yes. Copernicus. Who doesn't know how doubt lifts the hem of its nightgown to reveal another inch of thigh before the face of faith? I once didn't. I once thought I was my own geometry, my own geocentric planet spinning like a ballerina, alone at the center of the universe, at the command of a god, opening my music box with his dirty mouth. He said, "Let there be light." And I thought I was the light. I was a man's failed imagination. Now I know. What appears as the motion of heaven is just the motion of earth, not stars, not whatever I want.
Oh, blown away, blown away. So I'm thinking here.
Yeah.
I want to make sure everyone buys a copy of this book, okay? Because if you don't have this book, you need to have this book in your life. You can order it from Books and Books if you want to support your local Miami bookstore. There will be a book fair, or you can order it through Penguin Random, right? Or anywhere where books are sold, I imagine. But I urge you to buy something local if you can. And I want Paul to close us out with a poem of their choice.
Ooh. Okay, yes. I had the incredible honor of teaching a creative writing workshop with 12 Scorpio poets who, for all our astrological fans out there, you know what I mean. Thank you so much. We're here, we're doing okay. But at the time, I thought I was a Taurus sun, Cancer moon, Libra rising. And they all had a group chat where it was decided by the class I was wrong. And so after calling my mom, getting my birth certificate, finding my birth time, and plugging all the information into Cafe Astrology, I returned to the class and said, "You're right. I'm actually a Scorpio rising." And their challenge to me was, "Teacher, since you say that anything can be put in a poem, our invitation to you is to put the next movie you see into a poem." And I just so happened to be on this flight where my movie selection was very slim, and it was Finding Nemo. And there's this moment in the Disney Pixar classic Finding Nemo where our friends encounter an anglerfish. And I just thought, how incredible that creatures in the deep sea who have never seen the sun, who have never experienced light, who don't know what light is, through evolution, found a way to create their own source of light in order to find food, to find shelter, to find each other. And so I wanted to write about that, about how for so many of us who've been through hardships, great catastrophes, we had to create what we needed to live and to find those who we can love and who can love us in return. And we have had to create things we never could have imagined. And so I wanted to celebrate that genius, that innovation. And so this poem is called Bioluminescence, or the Finding Nemo poem. And it's, Bioluminescence. There's a dark so deep beneath the sea, the creatures beget their own light. This feat, this fact of adaptation, I could say, is beautiful, but those creatures are hideous. Lantern fish, hatchet fish, viper fish, I, not unlike them, forfeited beauty to glimpse the world hidden by eternal darkness, as subsisted on falling matter, unaware from where or why matter fell, and on those weaker creatures, beguiled by my luminosity, my hideous face opening suddenly to take them in to a darkness darker and more eternal than this underworld under water. I swam and swam toward nowhere and nothing. I, after so much isolation, so much indifference, kept going, even if going meant only waiting, hovering in place so far below, so far away from the rest of life, the terrestrial, made possible by and thereby dependent upon light. I did what I had to do. I stalked. I killed. I wanted to feel in my body at work, working to stay alive. I swam, I kept going, I waited. I found myself without meaning to, without contriving meaning at the time, in the company of creatures who, hideous like me, had to be their own illumination, their own God, their own Genesis. Often we feuded. Often we fused like anglerfish, blood to blood, desire to desire. We were wild, bewildered, beautiful in our wilderness and wildness in the most extreme conditions. We proved that life can exist. I exist. I am my life. I thought, approaching at last the bottom of the sea. It wasn't the bottom. It wasn't the sea.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul, for
Thank
spending this time with
you.
us. It's been a pleasure, and everyone who's listening, please check Paul out at the book fair on November 20th at 1 p.m. and buy a copy of All the Flowers Kneeling if you don't have one already. It's been such a pleasure. I really, truly thank you so much for spending this time with us, Paul.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you.